So I guess we are live, and welcome to Facebook live session with Matt Fitzgerald today, a special edition today. And we would like to welcome all of you. We had some minor glitches when we started out, but let's get going. And we have two wonderful guests today, and we have one of them who we all know. A lot of us at least know. We have Subramani Venkatesh, also known as Subbu to many. He's currently living in Boston and has a Ironman time of 9 hours, 40 minutes, something which every triathlete in India will envy. Welcome to you, Subbu.
Thank you very much, Vijay. I appreciate it to invite me for this wonderful conversation with Matt soon.
Great. So, in fact, it was in 2019 February that I had just completed my Delhi full marathon, and I remember that I had done a personal PR at that point of time. In fact, that same evening, I took the effort to reach out to the author of a book I was reading prior to running that race, and in fact, went out to thank him. And to my surprise, I got an immediate reply within a few hours or the next morning. That book was 80-20 Running, written by Matt Fitzgerald. And to talk about Matt, he's based in the US. He became a runner at the age of 11 after running the last mile of the 1983 Boston Marathon with his father, who had in fact run the whole thing, and along with his two brothers. He also had clear intentions to be a writer quite early in his life at the age of 9. Today, he has in fact mixed his passion for sports, fitness, and writing in an extraordinary way, authoring more than 20 books. He lives in California, and in fact, he recently beat the COVID, and that would be interesting to hear as well. Appreciate your joining us on behalf of Fast&Up and the entire endurance and running community in India, Matt. A few words from you?
Yes, thank you very much for the kind introduction. I will assume that I can be heard and seen, but if there's any difficulty, just let me know. Feel free to interrupt. It's Sunday morning here in California. It's Mother's Day, so I'll be giving my mom a call after this call. But I'm really delighted to be able to participate in this event. I've never been to India. I hope that my relationship with Fast&Up continues beyond this call, and maybe I can meet some of you in person in India one of these days. But this is a really fun first step here.
Thanks, Matt. And let's quickly get on to the discussions. We would love to hear questions from all of you. If you have any questions, please put it down on the comment section in the page that you are looking at. We will try and ask Matt at the end of the session. The way we have designed this session is to have around 5 capsules, including the Q&A. Let me kickstart with the first of the concepts that Matt has written about, the 80-20 principle.
There was an interesting pattern of intensity distribution. So not only do these athletes, and we're not talking just about running, we're talking about cross-country skiing, swimming, cycling, rowing, the whole family of endurance disciplines all over the world. The top performers, the national champions, the Olympians, were doing about 80% of their training at low intensity and the remaining 20% at moderate to high intensity. And additionally, historical research indicated that elite endurance athletes did not always train this way. So there seemed to be, biologists are familiar with a term known as convergent evolution. And that phenomenon refers to whenever there's an optimal solution to some problem in nature, that solution tends to be found independently in disparate places.
Yeah, Matt, you can go ahead. We were talking about the 80-20 principle, and we got stuck there. So please carry on.
Sure. So this is what the best endurance athletes in the world do. 80% of their training at low intensity, 20% at high or moderate to high intensity. So the obvious next question was, does this same intensity distribution also work best for everyday athletes who don't have the same genetic makeup as the elites and also don't do the kind of training volume? And some prospective studies were done because the studies involving elites were just observational. They're just looked at what they do. But with everyday runners and cyclists and triathletes, there have been studies where they take one group and have them train sort of in the normal way that most endurance athletes do. And I should say that's more of like a 50-50 intensity balance, where the typical recreational endurance athlete does about half of their training at moderate intensity. So they would have one group do that, another group do the 80-20 thing, and see who improved the most. And time after time, even runners who only run about 50K per week, which is pretty typical for recreational runners, they improve the most when they do about 80% of their training at low intensity, which does require slowing down for their easy runs. Now, it doesn't mean going slow all the time. You still get to run fast 20% of the time. I love running fast. Those are the workouts I look forward to. So this doesn't mean always going slow. And actually, you can go faster on your fast days if you do slow down for your easy days, because you're not as tired. So that's the origin of the 80-20 principle. And I've written a couple books about it now. And I also offer 80-20 training plans for triathletes and runners online.
So, Matt, I have the question on this with respect to 80-20 for the elite athletes distribution and the amateur athletes. Does this apply for a beginner athletes too? I mean, like, say they are coming into new training, into running. They don't have aware of anything about this. So, do they improve the same amount of time like the amateur athletes or elite athletes, or they respond more quickly for the same 80-20 training?
Yeah, really, honestly, no matter how you train, you will improve most rapidly when you are an absolute beginner. Vijay mentioned that I recently was sick. I believe I had the COVID-19 virus, and I lost a month of training. So when I was healthy and started training again, I was a beginner again because I had lost so much fitness. And it was amazing to see how quickly I improved. But I did immediately sort of go back to an 80-20 approach, because you really want to instill those habits early. I think it's possible if you, let's say that you're older, you're a beginner, you're overweight. And so when you begin, you really can't do very much. I think it is possible that you would maybe improve most quickly in the first few weeks if you did most of your training at high intensity, but that's not going to last very long. So I just say for everyone, just start doing the 80-20 thing. Because also, if you're a beginner, high intensity is very uncomfortable. And a big priority, it's not just the physiological side. You also want to instill enjoyment. You want to learn to enjoy the training. And if it's all hard and painful, you're probably going to quit. So I do really recommend it universally.
On the same note, like, do you encourage beginner athletes to do high intensity? Or put it this way, do you encourage them to do all kind of intensities, whether high endurance or just focus on mostly endurance when they come into running habits?
Yeah, I know you can start doing high intensity at the outset. And there have even been interesting studies showing that people who have frail health, people who have cancer, who they can tolerate high intensity training. It's not dangerous to train at high intensity. I mean, if you have an underlying heart condition, that's one thing, but these things are relatively rare. So it's not unsafe. I mean, what happens is if you are beginning at a low level of fitness, high intensity is not particularly fast. Like you are close to your limit, but you're not actually moving that quickly. But that changes as you get fitter. So it's perfectly safe for absolute beginners to train at the full range of intensities. But you can't tolerate a heck of a lot of anything. So you need to begin where you are and take the process step by step.
So now we're talking about intensities and low intensity. Can you describe the audience what exactly you're talking about? I came across on your book saying that many zones. Can you describe that to the audience, please?
Yes, yeah, that's a good question. I mean, the key threshold is known as the first ventilatory threshold, and um, it refers to an intensity at which your breathing rate um, accelerates. And so if you start off, imagine you're just walking slowly, and then you accelerate and you walk at a normal pace, and then you accelerate a little more and you're brisk walking, and then you break into a very slow jog, and then you accelerate more. As you go through this process of starting very slow and accelerating, your breathing rate increases, but it increases also very slowly at a slow linear rate. But at a certain point, it jumps, and it's not something you can actually feel. That threshold, if you were in a lab breathing into a mask, they could capture that threshold, but it's not. That threshold occurs at a relatively low intensity, about, for the typical person, 77 to 81% of maximum heart rate, which is that is the border between low and moderate intensity. And the reason is, when you get to that intensity, your muscles are demanding more oxygen. And there comes a point where, in order to supply the oxygen, your brain has to activate what are known as type 2 or fast twitch muscle fibers, which are not nearly as efficient. So what happens is, when you cross that threshold, if you're on one side of it, it's not very taxing to your nervous system, but it's almost like flipping a switch. As soon as you cross that threshold, the exercise becomes a lot more taxing to your autonomic nervous system, and it takes you longer to recover. And the problem is, if you ask someone to just go out and run at whatever pace they choose, at a natural pace for them, they will almost always be just above that threshold. Just going by feel, not looking at numbers, but just choosing their own pace, they'll be on the wrong side of that threshold. And like a small difference makes a big difference. So when I tell people that they need to slow down, you don't need to drastically slow down. You just need to slow down a little bit for your easy days to get below that threshold, so that the low intensity exercise is less taxing. You need less recovery. So you're doing overall the same amount of work. You just don't feel as tired from it.
Great. So the question I have on this one is, with the intensities and changes, what are the various physical adaptation that athlete experience when they do intensities, and how long they have to be keep doing? You said 20%. Do they include that every week, that intensity, or they have to do it in a periodization block, increase week by week? How do that help intensities doing it in 80-20 fashion?
Yeah, so yes, the 80-20 principle is very easy to understand, but it's not the whole story. Like, if all I told you was that you should do 80% of your training at low intensity, you still wouldn't know how to train, right? There are other rules that you need to follow. And when you get into that, you open a bit of a Pandora's box, because just to answer your question, no, you don't want to do exactly the same thing every week. Your training always needs to have a direction. And really it needs to do two things. If you're training for an event, some type of race, you're not going to get fitter unless your workload is increasing, and your workload is influenced by the amount of training you do and the intensity of training you do. So you have to factor both of those things together. So the training has to get more challenging over time. I mean, assuming you're already following the 80-20 rule, your training has to get more challenging in order for your body to progressively adapt and be capable of more and more and more. The other thing that it really should do is become more and more specific to the event you're preparing for. So imagine two runners. One is training for a 5-kilometer race and another is training for a marathon. Both of those runners should follow an 80-20 intensity balance. but their training should not be identical. The runner training for the 5K, much more intense, much shorter, less endurance demand, more speed demand. That runner should be doing, if you look at just the 20% part, they should be doing more of their 20% at high intensity versus moderate. That 20% bucket lumps together moderate and high intensity, but they're not really the same.
That's great.
The marathon runner should be doing more of that 20% at moderate versus high intensity. But for both of them, each week should look a little different than the week before and the next week. And there's just a lot that can be said about all the details of how to train effectively. But so many runners are just not even getting the 80-20 part right. That like if you could just fix that, that's the first thing you should fix. And if you fix it, that's half the battle, and then the rest is what we were just getting into.
Matt, I think we have talked enough about 80-20, and I think it's a subject in itself. You can talk for hours on that particular subject. I know it very well based on my own experience. But I think the other topic that you have extensively thought about, written about, is nutrition. And you have a few books based on that, if I can say, the endurance diet, diet cults. In fact, you have also looked at racing weight. And in fact, when I was looking at the diet cult, in fact, you had outlined 5 key strategies for optimal health and performance. In fact, I was listening to a podcast and you were saying that, you don't need to follow a cult, a particular way of diet. You should eat everything, eat quality, eat carb-centered, eat enough, and eat individually. I have already started getting audience questions of what is your thought or perspectives on nutrition and diet?
Yeah. So, as an athlete myself, there's a lot of fun. I think everyone listening knows there's a lot of contradictory opinions about how to eat, whether it's for health, weight loss, or endurance performance. Whatever your goal may be, you're going to get one opinion from one expert and another opinion from another expert. My perspective has always been, I'm an athlete myself and I want to improve and I care very much about my fitness and performance. So, I'm not just going to jump on board some fad because everybody's doing it. It's too risky. So my instinct has always been to look at solid science, but not just the science, but also to look at the practices of the most successful athletes. What did the person who won the race eat before the race? I want to know that and the science, and then make decisions about how to eat. And there's almost a dietary parallel to this 80-20 rule. The top endurance athletes all over the world seem to train in about the same way. Guess what? They also tend to eat in more or less the same way. My book, The Endurance Diet, I traveled all over the world. Unfortunately, not India, but I was in Kenya and Canada and Brazil. And I spent time with Japanese elite runners. And culturally, they eat differently, but the underlying patterns are very, very similar because diet affects fitness and performance just as much as training does. So you can't get away with just anything. And you have to, there's flexibility. Human metabolism is very adaptable. We don't all have to eat the same things, thank goodness. But there are certain rules you can't get away with breaking. And that's why I found wherever I traveled, when I spent time with elite endurance athletes, they were all obeying those rules, and you just enumerated them. So that's what I do myself. It starts with me. And yeah, my diet is modeled after the diets of elite endurance athletes. And it works very well for me. I just had my 49th birthday. I eat more or less the same way now as I did 15 years ago, when I was much younger, because it works and it's very sustainable. And so I encourage all athletes to at least treat that as their starting point, to understand what these patterns are, why they seem to work for elite endurance athletes, and emulate those patterns, and then, find their own spot. You mentioned the last of the 5 habits is to eat individually. So that's important too. It's not a one size fits all. It's important actually to try different things, to experiment, to see what works for you, what doesn't. But the one size fits all habits that you see at the elite level should be your starting point, I believe.
Okay, man, this is a very interesting topic. I really love your nutrition book. I would say it had a tremendous influence on me. That is the first book which I read, and I really loved it, every aspect of it. That is the Racing Weight, the second edition, which is my favorite book of yours.
Uh-huh.
So I'm glad Vijay brought up this topic as we're talking about 80-20. Yeah, 80-20 is a huge topic. We can go in. My next topic was coming up with the 80-20 connection was the nutrition as itself a 4th discipline we talk about in triathlon. Mm-hmm. You do all 3 physical activities, but if you miss with your nutrition habits, you screw up all the training that you did, right? I'm really happy with that. Now, coming to think about, you talked about every region has their own type of food, and they have to stick to their habits. Like in India, which is very rich in spices, right? Their food is flavorful and we love it. And do you think they have to switch to the habits that other country people are doing? And is it very important for them? What are the main things they have to concentrate? Can you break it up into the macronutrients that goes in? How much importance that you talked about the label reading in the book is critical to the athletes? Do they have to switch to foreign habits, like going to eat peanut butter sandwich or pizza? Is that important? Do they have to switch at all? So can you answer those, please?
Yeah. I'm glad you asked that question. But my philosophy is that if you're an endurance athlete who wants to improve your diet in order to perform better, you should change your diet as little as possible. There are a lot of, nutritionists out there who they have their philosophy and they cram it down each individual athlete's throat. So, if you walk into the office of one of these people and you say, I want to improve my diet, they'll just say, here's the diet. And they don't ask you what you eat now. They don't ask you where you're from, how you grew up eating, what you like, what you don't like, what you're allergic to, what your lifestyle is, what your values are. Perhaps you don't eat meat for ethical or religious reasons. Well, some nutritionists won't even ask, and I don't think that's a good idea. I think that instead of automatically starting over with a diet that is supposed to be perfect for everyone, you should simply evolve your current habits, because you really want to, yes, you want to change your diet to improve, but you don't want to make unnecessary changes, because presumably you eat the way you do for a reason, right? I mean, now it might not, you acknowledge that you need to improve it, but you probably like the food you eat. So if you don't have to stop eating something, why stop? And so I think that's very liberating, that concept for people, that, you don't have to start over. And there's also room for whatever your particular weakness might be. Maybe you like just to have a sweet every day. For me, I like beer. So I leave a little bit of room in my diet for beer. Obviously, too much of that is not good either, but it's something that gives me pleasure. So, I allow that. Doesn't mean I tell every athlete they need to drink beer. But so that's my philosophy, is that you look at what you're doing now, you find the areas that need to improve, and then you make the fewest adjustments necessary in order to achieve the goals. You don't aim for perfect. There's really no such thing. And even if there were, it would not be sustainable for you. Mm-hmm. And it doesn't have to be, the process can always continue, right. So you can make some initial changes, find your footing, and then see what else you might change to make further progress. So yeah.
But I mean, Matt, one of the questions related to that would be, as a individual, uh, how do I make those decisions, right? I mean, how do I know that something is good for me, something is not good for me? And that's probably the reason why people go after some of the fads, right? I mean, you follow a keto
Right.
diet or a paleo diet, maybe a gluten-free diet, or high carb, high fat, maybe. So how does an individual make those adjustments?
Yes. So again, I would start by making the adjustments that it, it it's almost a risk management approach that I advocate. That you see a lot of self-sabotage occur in the diet realm because people will make radical changes without really thinking through why. Why are they making those changes? Um, so I think the lowest risk changes are, the habits that I discuss in my endurance diet book. Those seem to be universals. So start there. Start practicing the habits that are practiced by the most successful endurance athletes. Of the five, the fifth one is eating individually. So that's the one that requires sort of the most time to figure out. You don't want to overthink it. I think people, there's a tendency, I don't know if it's less so in India, but America, where I am from, is a very individualistic country, and everyone thinks they're an exception to the rule here. It's like, oh, whatever works for everyone else, I'm so special. And you see that with diet. Like, everyone thinks they're allergic to everything.
Yeah.
Everyone thinks that their body reacts to the same food differently, and seldom is that the case. Like, metabolic individuality is real, but it's not as pervasive as some people like to think. So but you want to be a little bit scientific about it. So, and you really go by your results. If you need to lose weight and you make some changes and you're not losing weight, then there's probably another change that you need to make that you haven't made yet. If you have some limiter in your performance, for example, maybe you do very well in short, high intensity interval workouts, but you just don't seem to gain endurance as well as other athletes of your same ability level. That might be a limiter that's related to your diet. So you need to try to connect. You don't make changes just for the sake of changes. You're trying to solve problems. If there is no problem, don't try to solve it. But so if your fitness or your health are not where you want them to be, and there may be an underlying dietary reason, then you have to develop hunches, intuitions, like things that are hypotheses, things that are worth trying. But you want to do it in a risk management approach. You want to because there's an opportunity cost. When you make one change, you can't change everything at once. You're not going to know what the real solution is. So, and this is what the elite athletes do. They're willing to try things, but they're extremely selective about what they try. So they won't make a change to their diet unless they have really good reason to believe that it's going to pay off. And so they listen to the experts, the real experts, not the fad diet book authors, but the PhDs. And they will, so that's the way to do it. And it can be a little frustrating if you have a problem that seems resistant to a solution. Sometimes it takes a while to figure it out, but part of the responsibility, no one can wave a magic wand and give you the perfect diet for you.
Right.
Some of the responsibility is on you to figure things out over time.
So, okay. And maybe you heard this question, what I'm going to come up. This is going to be very interesting, and I want your thoughts on this and describe to the people. I know I came across a lot of questions, this one about the various diets that's coming up in the market now called LCHF, which is a keto, and the paleo diet. What are your thoughts on it? Can you please describe to the people? I think I admire everything what this book says, and I want to hear your thoughts to the audience about this fad diets that coming up in the market, not eating more carbs or eating low carbs, on eating high fat or eating only protein? I mean, I just want your thoughts on this to the people and what
Yeah.
you think and how it helps. Could you please
Yeah.
tell us?
So sure. One of the 5 habits that I see practiced by the best endurance athletes all over the world is eating what I call a carbohydrate-centered diet. That doesn't mean it's all high carbohydrate all the time, but these low carbohydrate diets, of which the high fat low carbohydrate diet is one variation, they've become so popular that I think a lot of recreational endurance athletes don't realize that very, very, very few elite endurance athletes are on one of these diets. They eat a lot of carbohydrate. And the science really indicates that is wise. There can be some benefit in having your carbohydrate intake fluctuate with your training. So to do certain individual workouts in a carbohydrate restricted state, or to maybe go through to eat less carbohydrate on a rest day or a light training day than you would on a higher training day. But that's, look at the runners of East Africa, the best runners in the world in Kenya and Ethiopia, extremely high carbohydrate intake all the time. And so as long as your diet is, if you're training a lot, and as long as your carbohydrate sources are natural and unprocessed for the most part, it's your safest starting point. So I would only start to move toward a low carbohydrate diet if that just doesn't seem to work for you. And carbohydrate can get a bad name because of the bad carbs that a lot of Americans, they get so many of their carbs from sugar and refined grains. Well, those aren't healthy foods. And so some athletes will go on a low carb diet and they'll get better results, and they'll say, see, low carb is better. But my response to that is, you actually would have gotten even better results if you had kept the good carbs and just gotten rid of the bad carbs. So yeah, I myself, again, I practice what I preach. I eat a carbohydrate centered diet, but I do have carbohydrate restricted workouts and low carb days sometimes. So, but that's kind of next level. There's your base diet, and then there are, you can manipulate your diet just the way you don't train the same way every day. You can eat somewhat differently on different days depending on what your immediate goals are.
So Matt, I'm going to switch track a little bit. We were talking about 80-20, the diet and nutrition. One of the, I would say, enthralling books in sports that I've read is the Iron War. And I should tell you that I haven't done a single triathlon, unlike Subbu. But what I saw in that book, The Greatest Race Ever Run, the story of that race in 1989 between Dave Scott and Mark Allen, was a unique insight for me, at least, into racing and competition. How did that book happen, and what can normal amateurs like us take away from that book?
Yeah, you mentioned when you introduced me that I've wanted to be a writer even longer than I've been a runner. And like many people who enjoy writing, I'm an avid reader as well. And so, people might assume, because of the nature of the books I write, that I read a lot of books about endurance sports, but I actually don't. I mostly read fiction. I was a literature major in college, and I love literature. And so there's a part of me that I like to write books that help athletes solve problems, but I also like to write the kind of book that I would actually read myself. And that's why, sort of I guess when I got into the middle of my career, I started doing more narrative writing, storytelling. So not just how-to books like those we've been discussing, but books like Iron War, which it has a message in it. I think there is practical value in reading it for endurance athletes, but it's also just meant to be an entertaining story. And, you know, in addition to being an athlete and a coach and a writer, I'm also a fan of endurance sports. Like I enjoy watching the best in the world compete. And you can learn a lot from getting to know the stories behind the athletes. And the story that I tell in Iron War is, I think, one of the greatest in the history of endurance sports. Everyone understands great rivalries. Like in the tennis realm, you have Chris Evert Lloyd and Martina Navratilova, who just battled each other at the highest level for years and years. So Dave Scott and Mark Allen had a very similar rivalry. And what's particularly fascinating about their story is that they were so different as men. They were alone without peers. Like they stood alone at the mountaintop of the sport in the 1980s and into the 90s, I should say, in Mark's case. But they couldn't have been more different. And one of the things that I do in telling the story, I think in an interesting way, it attacks the old question of nature versus nurture. You know, why are we the way we are? What determines our fate in the world? Is it the way we're born, or is it the experiences we have and the choices we make after we were born? And so you have Dave Scott and Mark Allen, who are the best in the world for a very long time in the sport of triathlon. Dave Scott is more of the nature guy. You know, I get into his background and tell there's some very funny stories about what he was like growing up. And he had no off switch. Dave Scott had to be moving all the time. He was like those sharks that die if they stop moving. You know, he just, in a way, it was a bit of a curse, but it also made he was born for Ironman triathlons, which didn't exist until he was well into his 20s. So he was a swimmer and a water polo player, and he was good at all these sports. But the thing that made him better, well, his real gift was his ability to suffer and to keep going. So it wasn't until this Ironman thing came around that suddenly he wasn't just good at something, he was the best at something. And it really just did seem to be because of something that he was born with. Mark Allen was a very different case. Mark Allen had a very troubled relationship with his father when he was growing up. And it damaged him as an athlete in the sense that he struggled with confidence. So just because of that dynamic that was established in that important relationship early in his life, he would fail in crisis moments in competition because he lacked confidence. He had talent, but he was lacking on the mental side. But also that there was like a hole inside him that he carried from those early experiences that also it motivated him. He wanted to prove himself to his father. So in a way, those experiences helped him and hurt him. And, you know, year after year, Mark Allen, you know, as soon as he found triathlon, he was great at it, but he could never win the big one. Year after year after year, Dave Scott had Mark's number at the Ironman World Championship. And so Mark's effort to, you know, get that monkey off his back and finally beat Dave and win the Ironman World Championship was really a personal journey of healing and discovering himself. And so it's just, you know, on the surface, you just see an amazing race, but there's so much humanity and pathos underneath it. And so as a fan of the sport, I like to get into that stuff to really humanize these people and let you see just kind of how much is at stake at this level of competition. And I just find it very inspiring. You know, it's one thing if you just think, oh, these guys run very fast because they're talented and they work hard. There's actually a lot more to it than that. When you realize that they're not superhuman, you know, that they have fears and doubts and bad days just like us, I think it's very empowering. It actually makes you realize, you know what, I can do that, you know, maybe not as fast, but I can find my limits just the way they found theirs, just as a kind of personal journey.
So Subbu, you are an accomplished Ironman yourself. So any thoughts? I mean, who do you align more yourself with, Dave or Mark?
I admire more Dave Scott for some reason. because it simply is nature, the way he dominates, the main reason that I really like, I like both of them, and there is no one much higher than low. The main reason I admire them is because they just flow with the wind, and they are not obsessed with the today's technologies, the things are going. I had this question to Matt, when they was interviewing these two people, what was your thinking about today's athletes are so obsessed with the gadgets and all the toys in the world, but these guys, they just work so hard, just focusing on pure the obsession of running or thinking, but not the gadgets, that the little things that gives them a big improvement. No, that's not their primary goal. They wanted to just enjoy it. How their body and mind connects to the body and connects entirely is what I like about them. So I had the same question to Matt. How much these athletes need to be obsessed with the today's technology? Is it really critical element for the improvement, or we have to just focus on the physiology changes aspects? Can you give us some questions, ideas about it, please?
Sure. Yeah. You know, the best endurance athletes, they do pay attention to details, and I refer to it as a no stone unturned approach. If when you're trying to be the best, and and to be the best, you have to beat the best. You have to, anything that can help you want to take a look at, right? At the same time, you really want to keep your focus on the things that matter the most, and not let the search for a leg up or an advantage to cause you to lose focus. And so the greatest athletes, they tend to have this they have their priorities right. They sort of understand what matters the most. And yes, what clearly matters the most is being willing and desiring to work very hard. Just investing themselves in the process of fulfilling 100% of their God-given ability, and then, but also not being like hubristic about it. I remember talking to a minor character in this book is Kenny Souza, who was the top duathlete of the day. And I remember him telling me, so he was like a national champion in run, bike, run. And he trained with Mark Allen. He was friends with Mark Allen. And I remember him telling me once that he was so confident in his ability on the bike that he rode a heavy, like steel frame bike for years after the technology took off, and he started losing races. And it was because he had too much confidence in, so there is a balance there. Like you want to keep your focus on, the mind and the body, but you don't want to forget about technology and, like little things like, I don't know, seeing a chiropractor, whatever it is, like the ancillary stuff, like pay attention to it. But the mistake that a lot of recreational athletes will make is they think, oh, if I just start taking this supplement, I don't have to train as hard or whatever. They look for shortcuts, and that never leads to fulfilling your potential.
That's great. I really like that response, actually. It's pretty cool.
I was just wondering, it's easy to get carried away into the Nike shoes, but I won't do that today because that's another long discussion that one will have to get into. But I want to take you to another enthralling story about you, Matt. Well into your 40s, you, I think in 2017 or so, decided to undergo 13 weeks of training with Olympic hopefuls at the Flagstaff in Arizona under coach Ben Rosario. Training, in fact, along with the Hoka One Arizona elite team. And you wanted to compete in the 2017 Chicago Marathon. And I did notice that you, in fact, did your PR of 2:39 at the age of around 46 years. In fact, improving the PR that you set 9 years back and finishing 5th in your age group. I mean, it's I mean, I know what it takes to get into that zone. A stupendous performance, I would say. But what made you do all that, and what was the process like? Because I think your latest book that you have launched is Running the Dream, which talks exactly about this experience of yours.
Yeah. So, you know, I was never, I was always a good runner. I was never a great runner. Even in high school, you know, I knew I wasn't going to the Olympics. I would never have a shoe contract. But I loved running so much that I sort of had an elite mindset, even though I didn't have, you know, elite talent. And I think a lot of athletes can relate. You fall in love with a sport, and it is a sport. You know, it's not only a sport, but the idea is to improve and see what you can do. So I think a lot of us have this fantasy, you know, if I could just put my job on hold for a while, if I could just make my entire life revolve around my training for a while, what could I do? It doesn't mean you stop caring about the rest of life, but it's a fantasy, and very few people outside of the young athletes with shoe contracts have the opportunity to have that experience. And so I wanted to live that experience for everyone. And so I came up with this idea of embedding myself with a team of professional runners for an entire summer. Flagstaff, Arizona is it's the next state over from California, but it's high altitude. It's very different. It's sort of a runner's paradise, just trails and mountains. And I lived with one of the members of the team. My wife came with me, and I lived the entire professional experience. I did everything, absolutely everything that they do. And so obviously, you know, even on my own, I was doing a lot of the things the pros do, but you can't do it all unless you're with them, unless you're in their environment and you have their resources, and you're either all in or you're not entirely all in. And I went all in for 13 weeks. And yeah, I was 46 years old and I was slowing down. You know, at no point had I just given up on my ambitions. I kept trying hard. I kept trying to get better, but I was in middle age now and I was slowing down. But as a result of this experience of going all in and doing what the pros do, and it's hard to identify any one thing. Was it the changes I made to my diet? Was it the having the physical therapy, or you know, the regular sports massage? Was it the high altitude? Was it the adjustments in my training? Was it just being in the team environment, the inspiration of having you know, these amazingly gifted athletes to train with? Whatever it was, it all added up to I almost felt like I was aging in reverse during those 13 weeks. I just felt and ran like a younger and younger man. And, you know, I mean, the numbers speak for themselves. Yes, I was able to run the fastest marathon. Yeah. So in the book, I simply tell the story of this experience. And, you know, I hope it's just an interesting story for people, but there is a message in this one as well, which is, don't let your ability level decide how far you take your journey as an athlete. Let your passion decide. If you love doing it, it doesn't matter if you're fast, slow, or in between. Take it as far as you want to take it. And so that's really the message of the book. And I hope that, especially, you know, when I wrote the book, I wasn't expecting it to be released during a global pandemic when a lot of athletes are really struggling to find motivation. I'm finding that the people who've read the book are, it's really giving them motivation to keep pushing and seeing how good they can be.
Is it available across the globe now?
Not everywhere. I mean, I can't say where it is and isn't available. I know it's available in the UK.
Sure.
Whether it's available in India yet, I do not know.
So, Matt, I mean, a very interesting session. So I think we have a lot of audience questions. Unfortunately, we'll not be able to take all of them. But let me just run through a few of the questions, and then you could answer those. We have one question from Karthik Subramaniam from Bangalore. I think he probably has a question which is slightly technical. What is more important, stride length or stride entropy? How do you measure stride entropy, especially at the amateur level?
Yeah, that's an esoteric concept. That entropy concept. It's almost impossible to measure without specialized equipment. But running form is self-optimizing. So the main way to improve, to become a more efficient runner is just to keep running. And that's one of those things that actually you improve drastically, automatically in your first few weeks of running. You'll never gain efficiency after those first 8 or 12 weeks as much as you do, because you're just simply practicing and your brain is learning how to avoid wasting energy. So your stride evolves in ways that you don't even realize are happening. There are, maybe I can share it with you after this discussion. I've written on this topic, and I have a recent blog post that's about ways that are effective and ways that are not effective to become a more efficient runner. And I think maybe the best way to more fully answer that question is to share that link.
So we have another question from Arvind, again from Bangalore, I presume. So he has a question on the 80-20 subject that we were talking about. His question is, most of the hobby amateur runners run very low mileage, say about 30 miles with 3 to 4 days of running. How would one go with 80-20 with such a low mileage? And how do I adapt to the 80-20 concept?
Yeah, so I like to think of it as no matter how little or how much you run, there are sort of 3 key days per week that you would like to have. And it can be made to work whether you run 3 times per week or 12 times per week, like the professionals. You can practice 80-20 and you still want to have those 3 key sessions. One should be a long endurance session, because even if you're a low volume or a low frequency athlete, you can make one of those workouts long and you'll benefit tremendously from doing it. Long is relative, obviously, but to think of it just as this is my key endurance building session. And that will probably, until you get very advanced, be entirely at low intensity. And then you probably want to set aside another day per week to focus on high intensity, and then a third day to focus on moderate intensity. And again, even if those are the only 3 times per week you run, you can adhere to an 80-20 balance, because you have total flexibility to decide in that high intensity day, well, exactly how much high intensity running are you going to do? If you're only running 3 times per week, it might be more of like what we call a fartlek session, where you're just dipping in and out of high intensity throughout the session. So it doesn't add up to all that much, but it's still a challenging workout for you. And it gives you the proportional amount of high intensity training you need, given the fact that you're only running 3 times per week. And then you just you can scale up from there. If you added a 4th day of running per week, a 5th day, you can just scale up that 80-20 balance. So a lot of flexibility. Even if you're only running 3 times per week, you can make it work.
Yeah, this is okay, Vijay. I mean, I want to just let Matt know that because triathletes who are typically low frequency runners, because they have so many other things to put into. So I think this idea of what you said really helps them to connect to 80-20 with low frequency and make it happen for triathletes, not just runners, I mean to say. Thank you very much.
There's a question on intermittent fasting from a couple of viewers, Amit and Aarti. Your views on intermittent fasting?
Yeah, intermittent fasting, I categorize it as one of those unnecessary ways to make something simple complicated. So, people will try intermittent fasting. They will get a good result, and they'll draw the conclusion that intermittent fasting was necessary to obtain that result. And my argument is no, it wasn't. Because not everyone who's getting optimal results is doing intermittent fasting. And I believe that you should try to find the simplest solution with your diet. Mm-hmm. So, you know, what the analogy I make, and it's a bit absurd, like imagine that you're in one room of your home and you want to get to the next room. You could get to the next room just by walking straight there, or you could get to the next room by walking around the entire earth in the other direction until you get to the next room from the other side of the planet. That to me is intermittent fasting. It's like, yes, you can get the same result, but it's unnecessarily difficult. So I steer people toward simpler ways of getting the same result.
No, I think I can imagine how debatable or debated nutrition as a topic is, because I'm actually getting a lot of questions on that. One more before I quickly move on to something else. We have Ingit Anand asking you, what's your views on plant-based diets for endurance athletes, especially, I mean, he's in fact an Ironman, so obviously he's coming from that perspective.
Yeah, so I mean, they absolutely can work. They're not, from that risk management perspective I talked about earlier, they're not the lowest risk way to use diet to optimize fitness and performance. So I hear from a lot of athletes who try a plant-based diet and have problems. You know, they either become anemic or they develop symptoms. They develop other deficiencies that actually have who have negative effects. So it's a little bit risky, and you know, I'm not saying that it's bad, because there are just too many examples of great endurance athletes who are on plant-based diets, and they're becoming more and more popular. But you have to approach them very carefully. And you know, I don't tell people whether to eat meat or not eat meat for ethical reasons. You know, like I simply come at it from the performance perspective, and I try to give people good advice about, you know, you make your own value-based choices about your diet, and then I tell you what the risks are and what you need to do to minimize risk and make it work. So plant-based diets absolutely can work for endurance athletes. But unless you have like some, you know, ethical reason, I don't advocate them as the starting point, just for, you know, for simple physiological reasons.
There's a question on strength training for runners. Obviously, US follows a slightly different methodology compared to other parts of the world. But this specific question is also about whether you should do high reps, low weights, or lesser number of reps and higher weights. So if you can throw some light on that.
Yeah, I would say both. You know, the optimal strength training program for a runner will combine different types of exercises. So some would be designed to actually make your larger muscle groups, known as prime movers, like stronger and more powerful. So think of exercises like deadlifts, you know, where you're moving large amounts of weight around with very simple compound movements. But that's not the only thing you need to do. There are also like little important stabilizing muscles in your body that don't, they just help you avoid being injured, but their running does not develop these muscles. So you also want to do exercises that like balancing on one. Every evening I go through a little routine where one of the exercises is balancing on one foot with my eyes closed. That's it. And I try to do it for 30 seconds on each foot. And if you're not used to it, it's hard, because those stabilizing muscles you use, there's no weight at all,
right?
You know, so that looks very different from a deadlift, right? But they're both effective for runners. They serve different purposes, but you would want, you know, you want various types of exercises in your program serving different purposes.
So on the same topic, for Matt, I want to ask you this. Do athletes have to think, I mean, the focus should be thinking like, is strength training as a supporting workout, or it should be thought as the performance improvement workout? What is the information you talk about, is this like something that just supports the running, or is it performance improvement running? Can you tell us about it?
Yeah, let's just, for like a professional athlete, it's a full-blown workout. When I train with the professionals in Flagstaff, we had one coached strength workout, team workout, where we're all in the same room every week, and it was an hour, and it was hard. It was really as hard as some of the run workouts I did. But I also would do little like kind of corrective exercise workouts every day on my own individually. So it's
saying
both.
that it doesn't improve the performance, but it helps stabilizing and prevent you from getting injured. Is that what you're trying to say?
It's both. It is both. And like, if you're currently not doing any strength training, the important thing to understand is that anything you do will benefit you. So like, even a little bit, and that's the way to think of it. Don't worry about doing what the pros do if you're not doing anything at all. Just finding, because a lot of runners, they don't like strength training, or they worry about, well, I'm already having trouble finding time to do all the running I want to do. How do I find time for this? Like, so just start with a little bit. You will get some benefit from it. And so you've taken a step forward. Don't worry about how far away from perfect you are. Just focus on that. Every little bit of strength training you add, if it's the right kind, will provide either injury prevention or performance benefit, or both.
All right. Thank you very much.
I will couple of questions more, and then we end the session, because there's so many questions which are coming up from the viewers. So quickly on the strength training aspect, you do 80-20, and then how many days of strength training should there be?
So if we're talking about full strength workouts, 2 to 3 per week. 2 is sufficient. But no, I would say no more than 3.
That question was from Vikram. We take one more question, or rather two more questions. Vineet Bhatia again asks, it's a lot of newbie runners, a lot of runners are around seeing this. He has a question, Vineet has a question asking, do you run on an empty stomach, or is it advisable to have something before you run? I mean, it's a very simple question, but I think there are so many answers to it, right? So what's your view on it?
Yeah, interestingly, to mention the runners from Kenya, again, who are really the best in the world, just as a matter of like their tradition, they run on an empty stomach, or almost empty stomach, very early in the morning every day. Now, they also run again later in the day, having eaten. But clearly it works for them to do about half of their running on an empty stomach and half in more a fueled state. That's unusual. In most other parts of the world, most competitive runners do most of their runs in a fueled state. So it's not harmful to run on an empty stomach, but like, for example, you would never want to race a marathon on an empty stomach, because the science shows that it is harming your performance. So it's just a good idea to keep that in mind. If for lifestyle reasons, if it's just more convenient to do a lot of your runs, say early in the morning on an empty stomach, that's okay. Your body can adapt to it, and there's actually a certain benefit you can get from it. But you're always going to have your best performances if you're in a fueled state. So generally, your key workouts should be done in a fueled state, and definitely your races.
Got it. My last question for the day, Matt, is again, I would like to tell the audience that I mean, because of the COVID situation, and I think Matt, you yourself did go through that process. So there are 2 questions to it. You beat the COVID, in fact. 2 questions related to that. What are the changes that you're seeing in running after the COVID? And 2, running is getting affected across the globe. So do you have any advice to the runners? How do they resume training, especially that you may not get the full block of 6 days because of lockdown, etc.? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, there's an expression, where there's a will, there's a way. So, when constraints are imposed on you because of a crisis like this, it's easy to focus on what's been taken away, but you can flip that around and focus on, well, what can I do? How can I adapt? I mentioned earlier that elite athletes tend to have a no stone unturned mentality. It's interesting to see how a lot of the elite runners are adapting, because that team I trained with in Flagstaff, they can't train together right now. They all have to run, and they're very accustomed to being able to run together and push each other to a higher level. They can't do it. They can't race, but you see how they're adapting, and it's, for example, they'll find a way to focus on something that they don't normally get to focus on. So for me, like, I've taken that same approach. I've taken the time to read up on the sport and educate myself. So I have more time to read. I have more time at home. So I'm trying to learn new things. So I'm taking something that's a negative and try to turn it into a positive. I've focused on my cooking more because I'm in the home. So I've learned new recipes, new healthy meals, improved my cooking skills. That's another thing you can do. I normally had a gym that I went to for my strength workouts. I can't go there. So I took the opportunity to buy a few inexpensive pieces of equipment that I can use to perform better strength workouts at home. So again, taking a negative and turning it into a positive. So you sort of have to assess your situation, but because it's different. Everyone's in a different situation. But the general advice is, don't think about what's been taken away. That's a given. Focus on what you can still do, how you can become resourceful to turn that negative into a positive.
Thank you so much, Matt. In fact, I've had a few comments coming in saying that we should have multiple sessions with you and Subbu. In fact, people have enjoyed it already. The different insights that they've got. I have to say that in India, we have a community which is based across the country, right from Delhi in the north to Mumbai in the west. Down south, you have a exciting group in multiple cities, including Bangalore, Chennai, Hyderabad, and to the east, Calcutta. So it's a large enough country. A lot of people getting into running. In fact, also into triathlons. In fact, last year we had the first half Ironman, which happened in India. So a lot of athletes are getting, in fact, trained under Subbu and others, aspiring Ironmen. So it's been a fantastic session. I would like to thank you and Subbu. Any last words from Subbu to the audience? And then we hand it over to Matt and we call it a day.
Simple. And just stick to the routines. Enjoy your workouts. Don't think too much about COVID. Don't think too much about technology. Just focus on what's today and tomorrow, not future, long term. Have a good workouts all the time. Good day.
Thank you so much. And Matt, last comments from you and we say bye.
Yeah, thank you for this opportunity. One of the things I love a lot that I haven't been able to do lately is travel. And I mentioned at the outset that I've never been to India, but I felt like I almost got to travel during these 80 minutes. So it's just been a really fun experience for me, and I would like to do it again sometime.
Thank you very much. Unfortunately, we had some technical issues in between, but I think all of us enjoyed. And you guys have a nice day in the US and stay safe. And thank you, everyone. Bye.
Thank you.
Thanks, Vijay. Thanks, Matt. Nice talking to you.
Bye, Matt.
Likewise.